June 7, 1944. 24 hours after the D-Day landings, Admiral Theodor Kranke, commander of German Naval Group West, reviewed intelligence reports at his headquarters in Paris with growing satisfaction. Despite the Allied foothold in Normandy, his assessment remained confident. The enemy had secured beaches but possessed no functioning port. Without harbour facilities capable of handling the massive tonnage required to sustain modern armies, the invasion would wither like a plant without water. Kranke's reasoning followed centuries of military logic. Armies required supplies measured in thousands of tons daily. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, replacement vehicles, and reinforcements demanded harbour infrastructure that took years to build and couldn't be improvised. The Wehrmacht had methodically destroyed or fortified every major port from Cherbourg to Antwerp. The Allies faced an impossible equation. They needed ports to sustain their invasion, but capturing ports required forces they couldn't sustain without these same facilities. It was the perfect strategic trap, or so German commanders believed. What Admiral Kranke didn't know was that 20 miles offshore from the Normandy beaches, the largest maritime engineering project in history was already underway. Across the English Channel, a fleet unlike any seen before was assembling. Not warships or transports, but components of 2 complete artificial harbours, each larger than Dover, prefabricated in British yards over 2 years of absolute secrecy, now being towed across the Channel to provide the impossible major port facilities where none existed. The Mulberry Harbours would deliver a logistical capability the German High Command had calculated was physically impossible to achieve, unloading 7,000 tons of supplies and vehicles daily within 2 weeks of D-Day, sustaining the Allied advance with tonnage that exceeded many established ports, all while German forces waited in vain for the supply crisis they were certain must come. The genesis of this impossible project began in the darkness of 1942, when British planners confronted an intractable problem. Any invasion of France would require capturing a major port immediately, yet German defences made this suicidal. Diepp's August 1942 disaster proved that direct assault on fortified harbours produced catastrophic casualties without guarantee of success. Even if captured, German engineers would ensure total destruction of facilities requiring months to repair. The problem seemed insurmountable until someone asked the question that changed everything. If we cannot capture a port, can we bring one with us? The concept was so audacious that initial reaction ranged from skepticism to outright dismissal. Build artificial harbours capable of handling ocean-going cargo vessels and transport ships, fabricate them in Britain, then somehow move them across the Channel to beaches swept by tides and storms? The engineering challenges appeared insurmountable, the logistical requirements staggering, the whole notion bordering on fantasy. Yet as planners examined alternatives, the artificial harbour concept remained the only solution that didn't require either suicidal frontal assaults or impossibly rapid capture of intact facilities. Winston Churchill himself championed the idea, scribbling his famous memo demanding piers for use on beaches. His support proved decisive in securing resources for what would become the largest construction project undertaken during the war. The task fell to a team of British engineers led by Brigadier Bruce White of the Royal Engineers, working with naval architects and civilian construction experts. They faced problems no one had solved before. How do you construct harbour facilities that can withstand the English Channel's notorious storms and 30-foot tides? How do you build structures large enough to accommodate Liberty ships and LSTs while making them transportable across the open ocean? How do you create instant harbour infrastructure without the bedrock foundations and permanent construction that conventional ports required? The solutions they devised represented engineering innovation on a scale that matched the Manhattan Project in ambition, if not in secrecy. The Mulberry Harbour design incorporated 5 distinct types of structures, each solving a specific challenge of artificial harbour construction. The breakwaters would be formed by block ships called gooseberries, old vessels deliberately sunk to create protective barriers, and massive concrete caissons called phoenixes that would be floated across the Channel, then sunk in precise positions to form outer breakwaters. Inside these barriers, floating pierheads called spuds would rise and fall with the tide, connected to shore by floating roadways called whales that could flex with wave action while supporting truck traffic. The entire system was designed for rapid deployment, maximum cargo handling capacity, and durability against channel weather that had wrecked conventional harbours throughout history. The Phoenix caissons alone represented a construction challenge of unprecedented scale. Each unit stood as tall as a 5-story building, measuring up to 200 feet long, 50 feet wide, and 60 feet high. They would be fabricated from reinforced concrete, a material chosen for its strength, availability, and relative ease of mass production. The largest Phoenix units displaced 6,000 tons, requiring careful attention to flotation, stability, and controlled sinking once positioned. British construction firms began building Phoenixes in early 1943 at sites across southern England. Fabrication occurred in dry docks, construction yards, and specially prepared sites along rivers and estuaries. Each caisson required thousands of tons of concrete, hundreds of tons of steel reinforcement, sophisticated internal compartments for buoyancy control, and precise construction to ensure they would sink evenly when flooded. The project consumed resources on an industrial scale. Cement production increased specifically for Phoenix construction, steel reinforcement diverted from other military projects, and labour forces numbering thousands working around the clock under absolute secrecy. Security surrounding Mulberry construction was extraordinary. Workers signed Official Secrets Act declarations, sites were designated restricted military zones, and cover stories explained the mysterious concrete structures as everything from submarine pens to floating docks for D-Day assault forces. German reconnaissance aircraft photographing British ports saw the construction, but intelligence analysts concluded they were defensive installations or standard dock facilities. The possibility that Britain was constructing 2 complete artificial harbours never entered German threat assessments. By May 1944, the components were ready. 145 Phoenix caissons of varying sizes, 23 pierheads weighing up to 2,000 tons each, 10 miles of floating roadway sections, and supporting equipment including the massive steel spools for cable and chain that would anchor everything in position. The logistics of moving this material across the channel dwarfed the complexities of the invasion itself. Each major component required individual towing, precise positioning, and assembly under combat conditions, while German forces attempted to disrupt operations. The movement began on D-Day itself. As assault troops fought on the beaches, the first Gooseberry block ships were already crossing the channel. These worn-out freighters and naval vessels, stripped of valuable equipment, were crewed by skeleton teams who would sail them into position and then deliberately sink them to form the initial breakwaters. By D-Day +1, block ships were settling into position off each of the 5 invasion beaches, creating partial protection for landing craft operations, while the massive Phoenix caissons prepared for their channel crossing. The Phoenix towing operations represented the most complex maritime movement in naval history. Each caisson, despite careful design, remained a marginal seafaring structure, stable when properly ballasted but vulnerable to rough seas. Towing speeds averaged just 3 knots, making the channel crossing a 12 to 20-hour journey depending on weather and tow route. Naval tugs, many of them American-built, hauled the massive concrete structures across waters where German submarines, E-boats, and air power might strike at any moment. The vulnerability was extreme. If German forces recognized what was being towed across the channel, concentrated attacks could destroy the entire Mulberry project before deployment. German intelligence failed completely to grasp what was occurring. Reconnaissance aircraft reported unusual vessel movements, but analysts assumed they were supporting the landing operations directly, perhaps providing fuel storage or ammunition dumps. The concept of towing artificial harbour components never appeared in situation reports. Admiral Cranker, confident the Allies faced inevitable supply constraints, focused on delaying the capture of Cherbourg while preparing demolitions to destroy that port's facilities completely when abandonment became necessary. He calculated the Allies couldn't sustain major operations for more than 2 weeks without capturing a functioning port. After that, logistics would strangle their offensive and force negotiated withdrawal or static defensive lines, vulnerable to counterattack. The mathematics seemed irrefutable. An infantry division required 700 tons of supplies daily. An armoured division needed 1,000 tons. With 12 Allied divisions ashore and more arriving, daily requirements approached 15,000 tons, quantities that beach landing operations could never sustain over time, especially as channel weather inevitably disrupted operations. By June 9th, the first Phoenix caissons were arriving off Normandy. The sinking process proved as complex as their construction. Each unit had to be positioned precisely within feet of planned locations to create effective breakwater walls. Ballast compartments were flooded in controlled sequence to ensure even settling. Positioning occurred under German artillery fire from shore batteries that recognized something significant was happening but couldn't identify exactly what. The Royal Navy provided covering fire, while specialized teams worked frantically to sink the Phoenixes in correct positions and alignments. The casualties among the crews performing this work rarely appear in official histories, but they were significant. German artillery killed or wounded dozens of workers positioning the caissons. Rough seas capsized boats moving between structures. Diving operations to verify positioning and adjust ballast led to deaths from drowning, hypothermia, and equipment failure. The Mulberry workforce suffered losses comparable to combat engineering units operating under direct fire, which in effect they were. By June 12th, the reality of Allied capabilities was becoming undeniable to German observers. Aerial reconnaissance showed massive concrete structures forming harbour walls where none existed days earlier. Floating piers extended from these barriers toward shore. Vehicle traffic moved across roadways that rose and fell with the tide. The impossible was occurring before German eyes, but the implications took time to fully register. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, visiting forward positions on June 14th, personally observed the Mulberry construction through binoculars. His reaction, documented by staff officers, reflected profound shock. "They have built harbours," he stated quietly. "Built them from nothing in days. This changes everything." Rommel understood immediately what many German commanders still couldn't grasp. The strategic assumption underpinning their defensive strategy, that Allies must capture ports quickly or face unsustainable logistics, had been invalidated. The artificial harbours provided capacity exceeding any realistic estimates of beach operation capabilities. The Allied forces could sustain major offensives indefinitely without capturing a single French port. The two Mulberry Harbours, designated Mulberry A for American forces at Omaha Beach and Mulberry B for British forces at Arromanches, began operations less than 2 weeks after D-Day. The scale of these installations defied comprehension even to those building them. Mulberry B, the British harbour, eventually incorporated 23 Phoenix caissons, forming 6,000 feet of breakwater, enclosing over 2 square miles of harbour space. Inside this protection, floating pierheads connected to shore by flexible roadways that accommodated the 30-foot tidal range, allowing continuous operations regardless of tide conditions. Cargo vessels could dock at the spud pierheads, offload directly onto trucks that drove across the whale roadways to shore, and return to England for additional cargo, all while protected from channel weather and swell. The throughput capacity matched or exceeded many natural harbours. Within 2 weeks of D-Day, Mulberry B was handling 7,000 tons of supplies daily. By July, capacity increased to 11,000 tons daily with efficient operations. The Americans achieved similar results at Mulberry A until catastrophic weather intervened. June 19th through 22nd brought the worst channel storm in 4 decades. Winds reached force 6 and 7, waves built to heights exceeding 15 feet, and the artificial harbours faced their ultimate test. Mulberry A suffered catastrophic damage. The American harbour at Omaha Beach, less protected by natural terrain features than its British counterpart, took the storm's full force. Phoenix caissons broke loose from moorings, floating roadway sections shattered, pierheads were driven ashore or sunk in wrong positions, and the entire facility effectively destroyed. The loss of Mulberry A forced a critical decision. Should resources be devoted to rebuilding it, or should the surviving Mulberry B be reinforced and expanded to handle increased tonnage? Logisticians calculated that Mulberry B, if properly reinforced and operated at maximum efficiency, could handle the required tonnage for both American and British forces. The decision was made. Mulberry A would be abandoned, its salvageable components used to repair and expand Mulberry B, creating a single super harbour at Arromanches, capable of handling unprecedented cargo volumes. The Great Storm, as it became known, actually validated the Mulberry concept even as it destroyed one installation. Traditional beach operations were completely halted for 4 days. No supplies reached shore through conventional landing craft operations. Yet Mulberry B, though damaged, continued limited operations throughout the storm and returned to full capacity within days of weather clearing. German commanders initially celebrated when reconnaissance reported Mulberry A's destruction. Finally, the expected Allied logistics crisis had arrived. But their satisfaction turned to bewilderment as Allied operations continued without visible disruption. Mulberry B, now receiving components salvaged from its destroyed twin, actually increased capacity. Meanwhile, the Americans implemented alternative solutions. The Gooseberry breakwaters at Utah Beach, formed from block ships, provided enough protection for LSTs to beach directly and offload. By June 27th, American forces had captured Cherbourg, though German demolitions rendered it unusable for months. The capture mattered less than expected, because artificial harbour capacity had sustained operations through the critical weeks when traditional doctrine said logistics must strangle Allied advances. The tonnage statistics documented the magnitude of Mulberry B's achievement. Between June 1944 and November 1944, the Arromanches artificial harbour handled over 2.5 million tons of supplies. This single prefabricated facility, assembled in less than 2 weeks, exceeded the cargo handling of many major European ports under peacetime conditions. Vehicle throughput was equally impressive. Over 339,000 vehicles crossed the Whale roadways between June and November, ranging from jeeps to Churchill tanks. The floating roadways, each section 80 feet long and 10 feet wide, supported this traffic while rising and falling with tides, flexing with waves, and enduring weather that would have damaged conventional pier structures. Personnel movement through Mulberry B totaled over 200,000 troops during its operational life. Hospital ships docked at the pier heads to offload wounded for transport to England. Supply ships arrived daily with everything from ammunition to mail from home. The harbour operated 24 hours daily with sophisticated traffic management that coordinated incoming vessels, outgoing empties, and the constant flow of cargo from ship to shore. The German reaction to Mulberry evolved from disbelief to grudging admiration to bitter recognition that Allied industrial capacity extended beyond merely building more tanks and aircraft. American Kriegsmarine officers studying post-war intelligence files expressed astonishment at the scale of Mulberry construction and deployment. Captain Hans Rudolf Rosing, who served on Admiral Kranke's staff, admitted in a 1956 interview that German naval intelligence never conceived such a project was possible, much less that Allied forces would execute it while simultaneously conducting the largest amphibious invasion in history. The fundamental failure was one of imagination. German military thinking, shaped by European warfare traditions and resource scarcity, simply couldn't envision the scale of Allied material abundance and engineering ambition. When confronted with problems, German solutions emphasized tactical brilliance and operational excellence. When confronted with the same problems, Allied solutions increasingly emphasized material abundance and engineering innovation on scales that rendered conventional tactics irrelevant. The Mulberry Harbours represented precisely this philosophy in action. Rather than accept the tactical necessity of capturing fortified ports at tremendous cost, Allied planners created artificial ports from scratch, eliminated the entire problem through industrial means, and sustained their invasion with logistics capacity the enemy calculated was impossible. The psychological impact on German commanders proved as significant as the material advantages. Every estimate, every calculation, every strategic assessment had assumed Allied logistics would reach breaking points that would force operational pauses, withdrawals, or negotiated settlements. When those breaking points never arrived, when supplies continued flowing despite lack of captured ports, despite channel weather, despite intensified U-boat operations, German commanders faced the reality that they fought an enemy operating under different rules where material constraints that governed European warfare didn't apply to American production capacity, backed by British determination and engineering excellence. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Supreme Commander West, received detailed reports on Mulberry operations in July 1944. His response, documented in war diary entries, reflected the strategic implications. The artificial harbours have provided the enemy with supply capacity we calculated they could not achieve for months. Our strategy of denying ports while preparing counter-offensive forces has been invalidated. The enemy has solved their logistics problem through engineering means we did not foresee. This changes the entire character of the campaign. Von Rundstedt understood that without supply constraints limiting Allied operations, German forces faced continuous pressure without the operational pauses that would allow regrouping, reinforcement, and counterattack. The war had become one of material attrition, a contest German forces could not win against enemies possessing both numerical superiority and logistical abundance guaranteed by artificial harbours that shouldn't exist but did. The engineers and workers who built Mulberry rarely received recognition proportional to their achievement. The project was classified throughout the war and remained largely unknown to the public for years afterward. Yet their accomplishment ranks among the greatest engineering feats of World War II. Over 15,000 workers participated in Phoenix construction alone. Thousands more fabricated pierheads, roadway sections, and supporting equipment. Naval crews towed components across the channel. Specialized teams positioned and sank caissons under fire. Maintenance crews kept the harbour operating through storms, air raids, and the inevitable deterioration of structures never intended for long-term use. The diversity of this workforce reflected Allied strength. British construction workers built Phoenixes. American tugboat crews towed them. Canadian naval personnel provided security. Merchant mariners from a dozen nations delivered supplies through the completed harbours. This international cooperation on an unprecedented engineering project symbolised the Allied advantage that ultimately proved decisive. The ability to mobilise resources and expertise on scales totalitarian Germany couldn't match despite controlling most of Europe. The technological innovations developed for Mulberry influenced post-war engineering in ways that extended far beyond military applications. The floating roadway system pioneered techniques later used in floating bridges and offshore oil platforms. The Phoenix caissons demonstrated that massive concrete structures could be floated, positioned, and deliberately sunk with precision. Lessons apply to everything from bridge piers to undersea tunnels. The project management techniques developed to coordinate construction across multiple sites, manage complex towing operations, and assemble components under combat conditions influenced large-scale construction projects for decades. The Mulberry Harbours proved that with sufficient engineering skill, material resources, and organisational ability, physical constraints that seemed insurmountable could be overcome through systematic application of industrial capability. This lesson resonated throughout Cold War military planning, where American strategy increasingly emphasised material abundance and technological innovation over traditional military virtues of courage, discipline, and tactical excellence. By autumn 1944, as Allied forces pushed inland and captured conventional ports, Mulberry B's strategic importance diminished, but its operational value continued. The harbour remained in use until November, when combination of storm damage, mechanical wear, and availability of conventional port facilities led to its gradual abandonment. The Phoenix caissons, too massive to economically salvage, remain off Arromanches today. Visible at low tide, they serve as permanent monuments to the engineering achievement that made victory possible. The whale roadway sections were eventually recovered and scrapped. The spud pier heads were towed to various locations, some converted to peacetime uses, others broken up. The block ships that formed Gooseberry breakwaters still lie on the seabed at each invasion beach, rusting remnants of vessels that served final duty as sacrificial barriers against channel waves. The human cost of Mulberry construction and operation is difficult to calculate precisely. Official records document dozens of deaths during construction, transport, and assembly. Unofficial estimates suggest casualties exceeded 200 when including injuries, accidents, and deaths from exposure and exhaustion. These men died building harbours, not fighting battles, but their sacrifice proved as essential to victory as any combat operation. Without their work, D-Day's success would have meant nothing. The invasion might have succeeded in establishing beachheads, but without Mulberry's logistical capability, those beachheads couldn't have expanded into the crushing offensive that liberated Western Europe. The artificial harbours turned tactical victory into strategic triumph by solving the fundamental problem that should have doomed the invasion to failure: how to supply massive armies without capturing ports. German post-war assessments universally identified Allied logistics symbolised by Mulberry Harbours as decisive in their defeat. General Siegfried Westphal, who served as Chief of Staff to Field Marshals Rommel and von Rundstedt, stated in 1949 testimony that recognition of Allied artificial harbour capability came too late to affect German strategy. By the time we understood what they had achieved at Arromanches, our defensive strategy was already obsolete. We had prepared to exploit Allied logistics vulnerabilities that these artificial harbours eliminated. This represented not just tactical surprise, but strategic invalidation of our entire defensive concept. Admiral Friedrich Rüger, Rommel's naval liaison officer who observed Mulberry construction firsthand, wrote extensively about the psychological impact. The artificial harbours demonstrated that Allied material resources exceeded anything we had imagined. When we realised they could construct complete harbours from prefabricated components and deploy them under combat conditions, we understood we fought an enemy operating on a different level of industrial capability. This demoralised commanders more than any battlefield defeat because it revealed the hopelessness of material competition against such overwhelming abundance. The Mulberry Harbours succeeded because they represented the culmination of Allied strategic advantages that German forces consistently underestimated. Material abundance that allowed construction of massive single-use structures considered economically insane by European standards. Engineering expertise that solved problems German engineers considered theoretically impossible. Industrial capacity that fabricated 15,000 tons of specialized equipment, while simultaneously building ships, aircraft, tanks, and all other implements of war. Organizational ability that coordinated construction across multiple sites, synchronized channel crossings, and assembled complex structures under enemy fire. Strategic vision that recognized logistics as equally important as tactics and allocated resources accordingly, even when immediate battlefield demands seemed more urgent. Each of these advantages contributed to Mulberry's success, but together they created a system German strategic thinking couldn't counter because it fundamentally misunderstood the nature of Allied strength. The artificial harbours validated Winston Churchill's strategic instincts despite significant opposition. Many British military leaders initially dismissed the concept as fantasy. American planners expressed skepticism about dedicating enormous resources to unproven technology. The Royal Navy questioned whether civilian engineers understood maritime conditions sufficiently. Churchill's personal advocacy, backed by operational necessity after Dieppe demonstrated port assault impossibility, pushed the project forward despite institutional resistance. His vision proved correct. The Mulberry Harbours provided the logistical foundation that transformed D-Day from risky gamble into inevitable victory. Without them, the invasion might have succeeded initially but faltered within weeks as supply shortages strangled offensive operations. With them, Allied forces sustained momentum that never allowed German forces to stabilise defences or mount effective counter-offensives. The comparison between Mulberry and German engineering achievements reveals fundamentally different approaches to warfare. Germany produced technological marvels including jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and advanced tanks that individually surpassed Allied equivalents. But these achievements represented attempts to overcome material disadvantages through technological superiority. The Allies, conversely, used technology to multiply material advantages, creating systems that leveraged industrial abundance rather than compensating for scarcity. Mulberry exemplified this philosophy perfectly. Rather than develop brilliant tactics to capture heavily defended ports, Allied engineers created artificial ports that rendered those defences irrelevant. Rather than accept logistics constraints as unchangeable parameters within which operations must be planned, they changed the parameters themselves through engineering innovation. This fundamental difference in approach, applying industrial means to solve military problems versus seeking military solutions to industrial limitations, ultimately determined the war's outcome more surely than any battlefield engagement. The speed of Mulberry deployment remained perhaps its most remarkable aspect. From D-Day on June 6th to operational capacity by June 20th represented just 14 days to assemble 2 complete artificial harbours under combat conditions. Conventional port construction required years even without enemy interference. The Dover Harbour facilities, comparable in capacity to Mulberry B, had been developed over centuries. The Allies built equivalent capacity in 2 weeks using prefabricated components towed across water under German fire. This achievement redefined possible in military engineering. the implications extended beyond World War II. If artificial harbours could be constructed and deployed so rapidly, what other supposedly fixed constraints might be overcome through systematic engineering and industrial application? The question influenced Cold War military planning profoundly. American strategy emphasized logistics and engineering to degrees unprecedented in military history, recognizing that material abundance properly applied could overcome almost any tactical or geographical disadvantage. By November 1944, when Mulberry B finally ceased major operations, the artificial harbour had fulfilled its mission completely. Allied forces controlled sufficient conventional port facilities including Cherbourg, though heavily damaged, and Antwerp captured but initially unusable due to German control of the Scheldt estuary. The transition from artificial to conventional port capacity occurred smoothly precisely because Mulberry had provided the critical months of supply abundance that sustained operations while damaged facilities were repaired. Without those months, the campaign might have stalled, allowing German forces to establish defensive lines and prolong the war indefinitely. The artificial harbours broke the potential stalemate, maintained offensive momentum, and ensured that Allied material superiority could be applied continuously without the pauses German strategy required for survival. The financial cost of Mulberry construction exceeded £50 million in 1944 currency, equivalent to over £3 billion today. This staggering sum raised questions even during the war about resource allocation. Could those funds have built more bombers, more tanks, more conventional military equipment? The answer, based on operational results, was that Mulberry represented perhaps the most cost-effective Allied expenditure of the entire war. The tonnage delivered through Arromanches, over 2.5 million tons, sustained the advance that liberated France, Belgium, and ultimately defeated Nazi Germany in Western Europe. No comparable expenditure on conventional weapons could have achieved similar strategic results. The artificial harbours proved that in modern warfare, logistics infrastructure could be more valuable than combat equipment, because without logistics capability, combat equipment couldn't be employed effectively regardless of quantity or quality. The German failure to develop countermeasures once Mulberry construction was detected reflected both material constraints and conceptual blindness. The Luftwaffe attempted several raids against the artificial harbours, but by June 1944, German air power in the west was effectively destroyed. The few aircraft that reached Arromanches faced overwhelming Allied fighter cover and devastating anti-aircraft fire from ships and shore batteries. Naval attacks using E-boats and U-boats proved equally ineffective. The artificial harbours were positioned beyond effective E-boat range and protected by minefields, patrol craft, and destroyer screens that prevented submarine approaches. The most effective German counter would have been long-range artillery, positioned on coastal heights, but Allied naval gunfire and advancing ground forces eliminated this threat before concentrated bombardment could destroy critical harbour components. More fundamentally, German commanders never developed systematic plans to counter Mulberry because they continued believing the artificial harbours were temporary expedients that would prove inadequate under winter conditions. They expected nature to destroy what German forces couldn't, that autumn storms would wreck the artificial harbours and finally create the supply crisis their strategy required. When this didn't occur, when Mulberry B continued operating efficiently despite deteriorating weather, the psychological impact on German morale was profound. Even nature, it seemed, favoured the Allies. The workers who built Mulberry received remarkably little recognition during or after the war. Security classification prevented publicity during construction. After victory, dramatic combat operations dominated public attention, while logistics achievements remained obscure despite their decisive importance. The Phoenix builders, the tow crews, the positioning teams, all performed work as dangerous as combat engineering under fire, which in effect it was. Yet they remained largely anonymous, their achievement known primarily to historians studying D-Day logistics rather than the general public celebrating military victories. This anonymity reflected broader patterns where support personnel who made victory possible received less recognition than combat forces who delivered victory. The pattern extended throughout the war. Merchant mariners who transported supplies across U-boat-infested waters suffered casualty rates exceeding many combat units but received minimal public recognition. construction battalions that built airfields, roads, and installations enabling offensive operations laboured in obscurity, engineers who maintained equipment, communications specialists who coordinated operations, logistics personnel who ensured supplies reached front lines, all contributed essentially to victory while remaining invisible to public celebrating more dramatic combat achievements. The Mulberry Harbours represented precisely this dynamic. Thousands of workers performed unglamorous but absolutely essential work building massive concrete structures, towing them across dangerous waters, positioning them under fire, and maintaining them under combat conditions. Their success made possible the liberation of Europe, yet their names appear in no monuments, their achievements inspire no films, their contribution remains known primarily to specialists studying logistics history. This obscurity doesn't diminish their achievement, but rather highlights how modern warfare increasingly depended on industrial and technical capabilities that traditional military cultures struggled to properly value and recognize. The artificial harbours proved that in industrial age warfare, the ability to project logistics capability could be more decisive than the ability to project military force. This lesson, learned at enormous cost during World War II, shaped Cold War American military doctrine that emphasized logistics, mobility, and sustainability as foundations of strategic capability. Today, the Phoenix caissons off Arromanches remain as Europe's most unusual monument. Tourists viewing these massive concrete structures at low tide rarely understand they're seeing components of history's largest engineering project undertaken under the combat conditions. The rusting steel reinforcement, the eroded concrete, the barnacle-covered surfaces all bear witness to an achievement that contemporary observers considered impossible. German commanders believed Allied forces were trapped without ports, dependent on fragile beach operations vulnerable to weather and attrition. The response was to build complete artificial harbours from scratch, deploy them in days, and sustain offensive operations at scales exceeding many conventional ports. This transformation of impossible to operational within 2 weeks of the largest amphibious invasion in history remains one of World War II's most remarkable but least celebrated achievements, decisive proof that industrial democracies could solve problems totalitarian regimes considered insurmountable.